This is Professor Kidwai. I hope that all of you are well. The function of this video lecture is to offer a kind of visual glossary so that all of you can better understand the techniques and methods of cinematography. Okay, this particular video is going to look at focal length. Okay, now focal length is a kind of technical aspect of cinematography. It has to do with lenses, with the relationship between the lens and the camera, the relationship between the lens and the object that's being viewed. It's a technical discussion, okay? So I want to just warn you in advance. I know that all of you are very familiar with, my lecture style. You're very familiar with my interests in this class. I'm typically much more interested in the film analysis, right? How filmic elements can be applied and what that application means for, the film's larger themes. I'm typically more interested in that. But these specific technical aspects of cinematography are extremely important to grasp in this class, okay? I would say that maybe the primary function of this class is to illuminate the topics that are in this particular chapter, in this week's lecture materials, which is the technical aspects of cinematography. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a couple of different slides. As you can see open on the screen, I have a PowerPoint presentation. I'll go to full screen right now. Here we go. Okay. Maybe it's not full screen. I'm not sure what you guys are seeing. Anyway, so moving into the visual glossary discussion of focal length. Okay, so what is important to understand about focal length is, of course, focal length is a consideration of the lens. Now, this is where sometimes the specific jargon or the specific technologies of cinematography can get confusing, okay? Because when we talk about focal length and the lens, we typically use a number to identify that particular lens. That number is measured in millimeters, okay, like a 50 millimeter lens, right? And that sometimes can be confused for types of film stock, right? Like sometimes we say that a film is shot on 35 millimeter. Well, that can be confusing because there's a 35 millimeter lens as well, right? Paul Thomas Anderson a couple of years ago, what was that film? The Master, I think. He shot that on 70 millimeter film, right? That's different from the lens. So please know that in the numbers that I'll be using, the numbers that are measured in millimeters, I'm talking specifically about the lens here, okay? Now, what is important to note about the lens is that cinematographers use different kinds of lenses when shooting to create different feelings and to create different views of the same subject, okay? Perspective is altered through the use of different lenses. The relationships between objects on screen, the relationships between the background and the foreground are altered through the use and the choice of specific lenses with specific focal lengths, okay? Lens choices, different lenses are often associated with a kind of distortion, right? That's particularly true for the use of wide-angle lenses and the use of long lenses, or sometimes known as telephoto lenses, right? Again, that very much impacts the way that the viewer sees the scene, okay? Lenses vary and are identified by this thing called focal length, which I've already mentioned a couple of different times. So let's see what is actually the focal length. Okay. Now, before I read whatever is on the screen, I'm going to tell you guys, I will make a confession that this is something that took me 10 years. 10 years to really understand, okay? From the beginning of my undergrad days when I was taking undergrad film studies classes to the end of my graduate work, okay? Even in graduate school, I could not really grasp this concept of focal length, the mechanics, the specific mechanics of focal length. I think it was maybe never presented to me in a clear enough way for me to really understand. So I'm going to try to go into detail so you guys really get it, you know? The book, which, you know, sometimes does a very good job of introducing key, you know, concepts in our understanding of cinema, the book very surprisingly kind of, you know, breezes over this topic. I think it spends maybe a total of, you know, 2 pages on focal length, and those 2 pages are dominated by images. So I wanted to give a more in-depth explanation of focal length so that you guys get it, okay? So focal length is important because it shapes perspective, and that shaping of perspective has a kind of psychological impact on the viewer. Okay, and I will give you specific examples so you can see what I mean, right? But before that, let's look at the specifics of the mechanics of focal length, right? Focal length refers to the distance between the point of convergence in a lens and the image plane. Okay, what exactly does this mean? What does this mean? Okay, what it means is that when light passes through a lens, those rays of light, maybe I can show you this image. When light passes through a lens, okay, those different rays of light converge, okay? They converge at a point that is called sometimes the point of convergence. Sometimes it's called the optical center of the lens, okay? Focal length refers to the distance between that point of conversion. I hope you guys can see convergence. I'm circling around it here. The focal length refers to the distance between the point of convergence and what is sometimes known as the image plane, okay, which is, you know, where the image is going. That could be, I don't know, the actual film, like the film strip, right? That could be some kind of digital camera sensor, whatever it is. This distance here between this optical plane, this image plane, okay, and the point of convergence in the lens, that specifically is the focal length, okay? So it refers to the distance between the point of convergence in a lens and the image plane, okay? Again, I've already said this, that variations in focal length will change and possibly distort relationships between images on the screen and sometimes between the background and the foreground, okay? So let's go through some of these diagrams that I have here to kind of explain a little bit further. So this is one I already showed you, which shows how light goes into a lens, how it meets into a point of convergence, and how that relates to the issue of focal length of lens, right? But this might be a more explanatory sort of image that can help you guys understand, okay? Which is that the change in focal length explicitly alters the angle of the field of view, okay? The longer the focal length is, the more narrow the angle is of the field of view, okay? The shorter the focal length is, the wider that field of view. Okay, so in other words, when you have a lens that has a really long focal length, right? That's sometimes called a long lens, it's called a telephoto lens. That lens has a narrower field of view than a medium lens or a wide angle lens. Okay, again, don't worry if this is confusing. I'm going to show you actual stills and video clips from films to very clearly give examples of this. Okay, the other diagram that I wanted to include here, and by the way, these 3 diagrams I completely stole from the internet. Okay, so these are plagiarized images. These are not, these aren't diagrams that I created, right? These are, better people than me who created these diagrams, right? This third diagram that I plagiarized, that I included in this lecture, I think gives you maybe a kind of geometric sense of how the variation in focal length will affect what we see on screen. In other words, it will affect the field of view. So you can see here, right? This is a lens with a shorter focal length, okay? And here we have a subject. I hope you can see my moving mouse, right? Here we have this subject, and the field of view includes all of the subject with this lens that is of shorter length, right? Whereas if the same subject is seen with a lens of a larger focal length, like that telephoto lens, okay, we're gonna see a more narrow or a smaller field of view, okay? So that is explicitly what the variation in focal length means in a technical way, and also how it affects what we are seeing on screen. Okay, so just to restate so it's clear, right? The shorter the focal length, the wider the angle of view, right? The longer the focal length, the more narrow the angle of view. Focal length, once again, is referring to the distance between the optical center of the lens, the point of convergence of the lens, and the image plane where the picture is going, right? The film stock or the digital sensor, whatever it is, okay? Let's keep going. Okay, focal length. When we talk about focal length, lenses are grouped into 3 types, right? We have the wide angle lens, the medium lens, the long lens. There are variations in these types of lenses, but I wanted to give you a sense of the number so you know, okay? The wide angle lens, as I've said already, is a lens with a short focal length. It's typically less than 35 millimeters, okay? I think Orson Welles used to shoot his early films. He shot using a 25 millimeter lens, or maybe it was a 24 millimeter lens, okay? Orson Welles known for the wide angle lens, right? The medium lens is a naturalistic lens, okay? The image ends up looking more naturalistic. And that's a lens that has a medium medium range of focal length, which is about 50 millimeters, okay? I think that Alfred Hitchcock shot a lot. Some of Hitchcock's best films are shot using 50 millimeter lenses. Yasujiro Ozu, right, who we are watching in this class in our discussion of cinematography, also used 50 millimeter lenses. I think Ozu built his sets around the usage of this particular lens, right? Then finally, the long lens, which is sometimes called the telephoto lens, but I think a telephoto lens is actually a specific type of long lens. But the long lens refers to lenses that have longer focal lengths, typically 100 millimeters or greater, okay? Let's keep going. The wide angle lens. This is what the wide angle lens does, okay? And I'm going to tell you how you can recognize a shot that has a wide angle lens. This is the part that I couldn't understand for years and years and years, okay? So I'm gonna try to explain this part as clearly as possible, right? As I've already said, the wide angle lens takes in a wide field of view. That's why it's called the wide angle lens, okay? Now, what this lens does is it impacts how the viewer sees depth. All right. The wide angle lens can often distort that depth, okay? And it can make images that are in the background seem smaller, seem more far away, and images that are in the foreground seem larger, seem more present, more intimidating, okay? So it's about depth. That's really where the wide angle lens is significant in its utilization, right? Again, these lenses, the wide angle lens and the telephoto lens, sometimes they're recognized through the use through the appearance of distortion. Okay, so in the case of the wide angle lens, the distortion that you'll see is that not only is the depth maybe exaggerated, right? The background seems smaller, but the images that are on the edges of the frame, right? The edges, the left-hand side and the right-hand side edges of the frame can be distorted and can appear bent if they are straight lines. If they are people or other objects at the edges of the frame, those people or those objects can appear to bulge or be stretched, okay? Maybe I can skip ahead and just show you the examples of the wide angle lens. Okay, so I mentioned that Orson Welles, especially in the early years of his career, he preferred to use wide angle lenses. That kind of distortion of the wide angle lens sometimes can give a sense of an influence from German Expressionism, right? I've talked about German Expressionism in this class. It was a film movement, obviously coming out of Germany, right? That was, a highly stylized movement in cinema, right? It was known for its stylization in mise-en-scène and in things like angles, right? Orson Welles, of course, was very influenced by German Expressionism. Other directors were as well, Alfred Hitchcock. And so, it's not a coincidence then that Orson Welles would use the wide angle lens, which can result in this kind of distortion, okay? So I'm going to show some images that are from two of his films, Touch of Evil and Citizen Kane, which of course we watched in this class already, okay? In this case, we see an example from Touch of Evil, and I wanted to show you this still so that you can see the background here seems very far away from the character that Orson Welles is. This is Orson Welles, by the way, you guys. I know he may be unrecognizable from Citizen Kane, but this is Orson Welles, right? This is the director who plays the detective in this film, the corrupt cop in this film, right? You can see in this still from Touch of Evil that the background seems much further away than it actually is, right? So that distortion of depth indicating to us that this is a wide angle lens, okay? Also, Orson Welles here seems larger than life. He is in the foreground, of course, of this image. His hand seems very large as well, okay? Let's go to another still. This other still can maybe, let me just see. Is this how I do it? Hold on one second, you guys. Okay, this is better. I'm so sorry, right? So let's go back to that image. It's now a little bit larger. You guys can see it, okay? So look at the relationship between the foreground and the relationship between the background, right? You see that stretching, that distortion of depth? Here's another still from Touch of Evil. I love this one, okay? In this case, Orson Welles' figure or Orson Welles' character is sort of in the background in comparison to this person who is in the foreground, right? How do we know? How do we know this is a wide-angle lens other than knowing that Orson Welles used wide-angle lenses, right? How do we know? Well, we can tell by the distortion, and the distortion in this case has a kind of impact on the viewer for the narrative, an impact in how the viewer is perceiving this character, right? Because here is Orson Welles sort of looming in the background of this shot, right? The shot is also angled. The shot, the camera is positioned low, looking up, right? So that also affects how we see this image. But what is so interesting is that his hands, right, which are in front of him, right, seem to be much larger. The hands seem to be much larger than normal, right? The hands are distorted. The hands are monstrous, right? They look like the hands of a killer. They look like the hands of someone who would murder. And that gives us a sense of the danger, right? The way in which this corrupt cop is dangerous, okay? So in this case, I would say a great application of the wide angle lens to give us a kind of feeling, right? To give us a fear, in other words, of Orson Welles' character, okay? Now, Orson Welles was also known, of course, for his pioneering use of deep focus. I discuss deep focus in detail when talking about mise-en-scène, so I'm actually not really going to address it at all in the lectures for this week and for next week. But I will remind all of you that, what deep focus refers to, of course, is that when different planes within the image are all in focus. So that which is all the way in the background is in focus, just like that which is in the foreground is in focus, okay? The wide angle lens, of course, facilitates this. In this case, this is the beginning of Citizen Kane, and we see Charles Kane as a little boy, right? And his whole life is about to change, and he doesn't know it yet. Okay, here is little Charles Kane. He's on the outside looking in, right? It's almost like we see him within a dream. And that's how his childhood is presented to us in the film. It's this idealized period of his life. It is the dream period of his life that he is forever seeking out as he grows older, right? So the wide angle lens here enabling us to see that. Here's another example of deep focus where Kane, where Charles Kane, the character played by Orson Welles is a young man here, is in the foreground, and we see these planes of information, right? Joseph Cotten here sort of in the middle, and we can see still in the deep focus that even the background is in focus, whatever is happening here, okay? Again, this is a possibility of the usage of a wide angle lens, okay? Another film that was shot in a wide-angle lens was Rosemary's Baby. I think that Roman Polanski used a wide-angle lens throughout the entire film. There's some aerial shots that use a different lens, but otherwise, the shots that are actually of the narrative that feature Rosemary, use this wide-angle lens. And when the cinematographer for the film was interviewed, and when Polanski talked about this film, they both indicated that this wide-angle lens was a very specific choice on the part of Polanski because he wanted that sense of unease that comes from the distortion. He wanted the viewer to feel as afraid and unhinged as Rosemary feels in the film. So in this case, the distortion of the wide-angle lens gives us a sense of this distorted narrative, this twisted narrative in which a woman's husband is willing to orchestrate her rape by the devil. Right? Her rape by the devil. The husband sets this up just so that he can advance in his career. Okay? So here's a still from the film Rosemary's Baby. I chose this still. Please forgive the old people nudity here. I chose this still because it's kind of a great example of the distortion at the sides of the frame that I was referring to before. Okay? Look at the individuals, towards the center, right? In the background. We can see these individuals. In other words, their proportions are relatively normal, okay? But when we look at the edges here, okay, it looks like a woman on this edge and it looks like another woman on this edge. We see the distortion begin, right? Can you see that? How it's like blurred and pulled, right? Blurred and stretched out. That's the distortion of the wide angle lens that will help you identify this lens, okay? Here's another example of why Polanski would use the wide-angle lens in this film. Here we have the character of Minnie. Minnie, of course, will turn out to be a worshiper of Satan, right? And here she is in the frame, like looming larger than life, looking almost demonic with this insane makeup that she has, right? So the distortion here of depth where these characters behind her are probably, you know, just a few feet away, but they look further away, you know, than what is the reality of how it was shot, right? It shows us the wide angle lens here used to highlight the significance, the madness of Minnie, right? We get a great image of this, you know, this crazy woman with her crazy makeup. We get a very clear sense of it in this image through the use of the wide angle lens, okay? Let's keep going. This is a still, forgive the fact that it's black and white. This is a still from the film when Rosemary is running away from everyone, when she knows, this is towards the end of the movie, she's very pregnant here, and she knows what's going on. She knows that she's been impregnated by the devil. And I chose this still so that we could see, you know, that the hallway looks very long here, right? This depth is not in any way collapsed at all. And it emphasizes, you know, how far she has to go. It emphasizes how much she's running away from these people, okay? The last thing that I'll talk about in this lecture is the use of the long lens, and I'm only going to give one example here. If you want, you know, the textbook gives some stills that show the long lens. If you want, you can go through the textbook in a little bit more detail. You can also look up long lens examples or telephoto lens examples. Let me define what the long lens is. The long lens offers a more narrow angle of vision. Okay, this lens will flatten depth. Okay, so that means that objects in the background appear closer than they are, right? It's like the rear view mirror of the car, right? There must be some relation between that mirror and this lens. So that kind of distortion is opposite. It's opposite from the wide angle lens, okay? So let's look at an example from the film Run Lola Run, okay? Now I absolutely love this example, because this example shows us, again, the narrative and symbolic possibilities of the application of a technical aspect, such as the long lens, right? So this is a moment in the film, if you've seen Run Lola Run, you'll know that it's a young woman who is desperate to find money to save the life of her boyfriend, right? And this still that we see occurs in the first third of the film, in which Lola has received tons of bad news. I don't want to go into it, because if you haven't seen this movie, you should really watch it. It's a wonderful film. It's very contemporary and fresh. So I think, you know, especially the young people in the class will like it. I won't give away what it is that she finds out here, but she's devastated. Okay, director Tom Tykwer decides to shoot the scene using a long lens. How do we know that? Well, the background here is all distorted, right? And this woman who's right here, who is in the background, appears to be close to Lola. Okay, now she's going to be walking towards Lola, and one of the things that the long lens does is it also distorts movement from the background to the foreground. So when someone is moving from the background to the foreground, they could be taking, you know, 50 steps or something, but they appear on the screen as if they're not really moving, okay? So we're going to watch it here, and then we're going to analyze the narrative possibilities for the use of this lens. Let's watch this scene. The woman is walking. She's kind of standing in place. She's walking, she's walking, she's walking. And then look.
Kind, was ist?
Who the hell is that, you guys? Right? Doesn't it look like a completely different woman than who we saw just a few seconds ago? Maybe this isn't going to let me show you. It was a completely different woman, right, than who we just saw moments earlier. I'm so sorry, you guys.
Man sieht sich.
Okay, this woman here looks like a young woman, right? Whereas we know the woman in the next scene is an old woman, right? We know she's old. So what's the point here? What's the point? What Tom Tykwer is saying is that not only is space getting distorted in this moment of pure trauma for Lola, this is Lola, right? In this moment of pure trauma for Lola, where she's gotten this terrible news, not only is space getting distorted through the long lens, but time is getting stretched out and distorted, right? Think about the worst moments in your life and time seems to slow down. A friend of mine committed suicide, and in the weeks and months after his death, it felt like one long night. That trauma stretched out time for me, right? Tom Tykwer indicating the same thing by changing that young woman to this very old woman, that moment of Lola's trauma seemed to take years and years and years and years, that a woman on screen with her would go from being young to being old. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here. I really didn't want to take a half an hour to discuss focal length. I'm sorry about that. Anyway, I will speak to you again in another video lecture. Thank you so much, you guys. I hope that all of you are well. Thanks. Take care.